And now we go to Washington for a very special guest. He is the Vice President of the United States of America, Mike Pence, joining us over the telephone. So, Mr. Vice President, thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it.
You bet, David. Thank you.
So let's start with those jobless claims. 6.6 million, 10 million over 2 weeks. It gets all of our attention. I know it does yours and the president's attention without a doubt. To some extent, we did this on purpose as a way of fighting the coronavirus. But what do you have to say to the American people, to those 10 million people who now are out of work, and frankly, to millions more that looks like they will be out of work?
Well, I want to tell the American people that help is on the way. Thanks to the president's leadership and strong bipartisan support in the House and Senate, we passed a historic relief bill that will soon be speeding aid to American families. The average family of four will receive a direct payment of $3,400. There are going to be loans which will operate as grants, essentially, for small businesses to support payroll. During the course of the coronavirus epidemic, businesses of small businesses around America would be able to keep people on their payroll during that period of time. We're going to be supporting our major industries around the country, and we'll get through this. We've supported unemployment insurance benefits for the states. We're working closely with governors to make sure that those that are impacted have the support to see their family, to see their businesses, and to see their communities through the course of the coronavirus. And we really do believe that as Americans put into practice the president's coronavirus guidelines, 30 days to slow the spread, that will every single day be one day closer to putting the coronavirus behind us. Our priority is health. Our priority is the health and well-being and the lives of the American people, supporting our incredible healthcare workers. The president has every confidence that as we help people through this time, that the economy will come back stronger than ever before. But we'll stay focused on defeating this virus and giving the American people and our healthcare workers the tools to do just that.
Let's turn to that battle against what the president has called that invisible enemy, that is the coronavirus. Bloomberg reported earlier this week that there's classified intelligence information that China actually sat on the information about how bad it was. If you had known when China did how bad it was, would it have made our battle plan against this enemy different? How many American lives might have been saved?
Well, there's no question that had China been more forthcoming than they have been about the impact and the scope and the nature of the coronavirus, not just to the United States but to the world, that it would have made a difference. That being said, we did have a team on the ground in February. We were able to look at their data. We drew conclusions from that, and I have to tell you, I think, when the very first coronavirus case emerged in this country, someone who had been in China and contracted it there, in a matter of days, the president stood up the White House Coronavirus Task Force, suspended all travel from China. From there, would issue travel advisories for South Korea and portions of Italy. We began screening 100% of all passengers from both of those countries, going on to suspend travel from Europe, the UK, Ireland. I think all along the way, the American people have seen that this president has been willing to take decisive and at times, David, unprecedented action to put the health of America first. And we are continuing to bring not only a whole of government approach at every level, federal, state, and local, but also a whole of America approach. We're seeing American businesses step forward as never before to meet this moment, and that's where we'll keep our focus. And I truly do believe that as every American does their part, whether they're in an area impacted by the coronavirus significantly yet or not, if they do their part to heed state and local authorities, if they do their part to engage in the social distancing and the mitigation efforts the president has advised for every American, we will put the coronavirus in the past, and we will save lives, and we'll bring our nation back.
Mr. Vice President, I don't think there's anyone who questions that the President and you, the entire team at the White House, is doing everything you can at this point to try to stop this. At the same time, to some extent, it appears we've been playing from behind. The virus has been ahead of us. Do we have enough testing capability right now to get ahead of the virus? I'm talking about not the hotspots of New York, for example, or Detroit, increasingly New Orleans. Do you know what are likely to be the next hotspots?
Well, what I can tell you, David, is that because of the public-private partnership we forged with these vast commercial labs that your listeners know well, LabCorp, Quest, others, companies like Roche, we're now testing over 100,000 Americans a day. But a very significant breakthrough happened this weekend. Again, moving with record speed, the FDA approved Abbott Laboratories point-of-care test. It literally is a 15-minute test that people can have administered at their local doctor's office. We're in the process of identifying the thousands of Abbott Laboratory machines that are around the country. We're making sure that we're distributing those not just to areas that are seeing an impact today, but we want to distribute those as Abbott Laboratories making about 50,000 tests a day now. We want to distribute those to areas where we can do what you had implied is the kind of surveillance testing that would allow states that currently don't have a significant outbreak to be forewarned and forearmed and to be able to do the kind of contact tracing that would limit the exposure and the spread of the coronavirus. But the last point is, in answer to the other part of your question, we literally are tracking every single day the number of cases that are coming out, where they're coming out. I've already received a briefing this morning of county by county, state by state analysis, and that's informing our coordination not only with the Strategic National Stockpile, FEMA, but with healthcare distributors around the country about where we are sourcing and focusing everything from personal protective equipment to all the supplies that our healthcare workers need. We're focusing it where the outbreaks are. We're working closely with governors to support their requests, whether it be for personal protective equipment or field hospitals, and we'll continue to do that around the clock.
Vice President Pence, let's talk about the personal protective equipment and also ventilators at the same time. You're coordinating, you're monitoring, you're encouraging. Is there a serious consideration being given to centralizing the allocation of these? We've heard from some governors, such as Governor Cuomo, that actually states are having to bid against each other for ventilators. Is there a thought that we should have a central location? It would be under you, I assume, at the task force that will decide where the PAPRs go, where the N95s go, where the ventilators go.
When the president signed the National Disaster Declaration a few weeks ago, he stood up FEMA as the lead coordinator of our nation's response. And FEMA has been working very closely through all of its regional administrators, working with governors to process requests, not just from the national stockpile, but also we're working with distributors around the country, and we're directing them in many cases where we need that personal protective equipment to go. We actually established what the president has called an air bridge. It'll be about 51 flights from all over the world bringing in supplies for healthcare workers. We already were wheels down Sunday at JFK, Monday in Chicago. We were landing in Miami last night, and those flights are going to continue to come in literally around the clock. But what we're doing there, David, is we're taking 90% of those resources and deploying them through distributors to go directly to the point of the need where hospital workers are asking for and requesting personal protective equipment. And it is a way that we can use the strength of the private sector's distribution system and the direction of our logistics team at FEMA to meet this moment. And as we track, the initial outbreak was the Seattle area, Washington State, then California. Now the epicenter is the greater New York City area. What we're doing is working with distributors to bring the supplies in to increase production here at home, and then directing them to where they're needed most.
Mr. Vice President, your time truly is precious, and we appreciate you sharing it with us today. We don't want to take advantage of that, so we're going to let you go. Thank you so much to Vice President Mike Pence on the telephone. Thank you, sir. And now we're going to turn to our White House correspondent. He is Josh Wingrove, and he's going to give us his reaction to what we just heard from Vice President Pence. Josh?
Hi, yeah. So it was good that we asked there about the supply shortages, and what I didn't hear really was an answer, I guess, to whether they would respond to the call of governors to coordinate the purchasing of this. We have cases where New York and California, for instance, are bidding up each other for the same ventilators, and I guess that if governors continue to think that there's a federal role to play, the federal government doesn't seem to agree. I think that's one of the core questions here going forward in determining what the federal government can do to help deal with this. But remember, we had a big change in tone a few days ago with the Trump administration on this, and they've pivoted, of course, now to saying that the current forecasts show that about 100,000 to 200,000 Americans will die out of this coronavirus outbreak. And so that is obviously raising the pressure on all levels of government to do what they can to keep that number as low as possible.
Yeah, and as you suggest, Josh, we hear from people like Governor Cuomo saying you got to take control of this and really allocate these things so we're not bidding against one another. Okay, thank you so much to Josh Wingrove. He's our Bloomberg White House correspondent. Coming up next, we're going to talk with a former SEC commissioner about how the markets are reacting and are they really functioning the way they should. This is Bloomberg Balance of Power. I'm David Westin, and this is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. The markets have really been put through the ringer the last few weeks, and how have they held up? Let's turn to somebody now who was responsible for regulating them, and he is Michael Pivovar. He's now with the Milken Institute, but he was at one point an SEC commissioner, and before that, a senior chief economist, really, to the Republican Banking Committee up on the Hill. So, Michael, thank you so much for joining us. Give us a sense, you know these markets so well, how have the markets, take the equity markets, the stock markets, have they really held up under an awful lot of stress and strain?
Yes, the markets, from a structure standpoint, the markets are performing exactly as they should. There's a lot of volatility in the markets. Last week, obviously, we saw a lot of downturn, a lot of negative news coming into the markets, but there's a lot of positive news coming in as well. And so from all accounts, what we've seen is the markets are performing as they should. They're reflecting the prices. They're reflecting a lot of new information that's coming into the market. There is a lot of volatility. What regulators are concerned about is what we call bad volatility or transitory volatility. That's the volatility that occurs from when there's liquidity dries up and you don't have enough buyers at a particular point in time. And that's what the market circuit breakers are designed to do. And those seem to have worked well in the past few weeks. But what the market is doing well is it is incorporating fundamental volatility. There's a lot of new information coming in, whether it's the overall economy, or whether it's particular information about particular industries or particular information about particular companies. And those prices that are being produced by the market are very valuable, not only for investors, but for policymakers.
So from your point of view, is there need to revise some of the circuit breakers when we're done with them? I mean, the circuit breakers, I think, originally came out in '87, didn't they, after we had that little crash? If you were there today, would you be taking a look and say, we've learned some things, we might want to change some rules?
Yes, and in fact, you can be sure that the Securities and Exchange Commission is already doing that. The market breakers were originally set, as you mentioned, in 1987 after the stock market crash. There's three tiers to them. Last week, the first tier was tripped, I believe, 4 times. We never made it to the second and third tier. And so you can be sure that they're calibrating those or thinking about the need to calibrate those. A couple other things to keep in mind is that there's also single stock circuit breakers. And we have limit up, limit down that the Securities and Exchange Commission put in to look at whether there's particularly bad volatility for particular stocks. Those seem to be working well. Those are constantly recalibrated. You can be sure that they're looking at those as we speak. And the other thing to keep in mind is that the Commodity Futures Trading Commission has similar circuit breakers in the futures market, and the regulators are looking to make sure that those are coordinated so that they work together and don't work at cross purposes.
Michael, it's not just the stock market that you've been involved in. As I say, you were chief economist over the Banking Committee in the Senate. Give us a sense of how the banks are holding up. You have had some views in the past about some of the regulation coming under Dodd-Frank. That's come under a lot of stress and strain as well here. How are the banks faring? How's the financial system doing right now?
The financial system, by all accounts, is doing very well. If you think back to the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, when I happened to be working at the White House at the Council of Economic Advisors, that crisis started in the financial sector. We had an unhealthy banking system. The banks were undercapitalized. There was too much leverage. There was too much hidden leverage in the system. The regulators didn't know much about it. And then that had spillovers to the real economy. In the current COVID-19 crisis, what we have is a health crisis that now has required a government response that effectively is causing a temporary economic downturn. We have supply shocks where we have global supply chains that are disrupted, travel restrictions and the like. We also have a demand shock because many businesses are forced to temporarily shut down. People are forced into quarantines, lockdowns, stay-at-home orders throughout the world. But by all accounts, the financial sector is strong. And in fact, if comparing it to the 2008-2009 global financial crisis, right, banks were the problem. And if you look at the government's response, particularly in the United States, the government is using the banks. They're now part of the solution. Take, for example, the Paycheck Protection Program that Treasury and the Small Business Administration is standing up. Rather than having the government work directly with millions of small businesses, what they're doing is they're using the banks as intermediaries of this program so that the government can deal with thousands of banks who in turn deal with thousands of businesses.
We talked with the CEO and chairman of Bank of America, Brian Moynihan, yesterday, and he said that, in fact, because of all those regulations, the banks, Bank of America and others, have plenty of reserves, actually, at this point. Do we need to think at all about backing off on some of those regulations, or are they strong enough that they can support this effort to really cushion the blows right now and ultimately restart the economy?
So the Federal Reserve is looking at this in real time. And in fact, on Wednesday, the Federal Reserve has backed off a little bit on their supplemental leverage ratios. The bank regulators, the securities regulators like the SEC, mild shop, the CFTC, and the other regulators are looking at whether or not there needs to be flexibility in their regulation to deal with the crisis. Right now, what they're focused on is making sure that the banks and the other intermediaries can continue to provide the functions that they need to do in the market. After this is all said and done, there will be plenty of time to look back and to look at whether or not the regulations that were in place before the crisis actually helped put the banking sector on a stronger footing, or in some cases, did they actually hinder some of the response to the crisis? And so they will be taking a look at that on the back end of this.
Okay, Michael, I really appreciate you joining us today. That's Michael Pivovar of the Milken Institute. In the meantime, we're going to get a check on the markets coming up next as equities for a change are being supported by oil today. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Equity markets have made a turnaround today despite those jobless claim numbers because of oil. And Abigail Doolittle is here to give us a report. Abigail?
Well, David, that is correct for sure. The big story today is oil absolutely soaring. And this, of course, as President Trump earlier this morning indicated that the Saudis and Russia could cut production by 10 million barrels. It's not entirely clear if that's per day or what time period. It's also not entirely clear if it will actually happen. But nonetheless, a huge tailwind for stocks overall, as you mentioned, really turning around some of the weakness from jobless claims. Right now, the S&P 500 up about 1.9%. Oil at the highs, headed to its best day ever, up 35% now off of those highs. On the year, though, it's a different story. Oil is down nearly 60%. The energy sector, which is getting such a boost today, down about 50% relative to the S&P 500, down 22%. Keep an eye on oil, David. It clearly is a tell for stocks, given its important role around the economic demand picture and, of course, the liquidity. But today, risk on, and oil soaring is a big piece of that story, David.
Yeah, oil sure is a tell for stocks today, no question about it. Thanks so much to Abigail Doolittle for that report. Coming up next, we're going to talk with Afsani Beshelis of the Rock Creek Group. She started out as an oil economist. We're going to talk to her about what's going on in the oil markets. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Oil is really rebounding sharply today. This is after President Trump tweeted that, in fact, he had talked to Mohammed bin Salman over in Saudi Arabia, and the Russians and the Saudis were going to cut oil production 10 million barrels. Wasn't clear over what period of time. We're joined now by Afsani Beshlas, who heads up the Rock Creek Group. Before that, she was at the World Bank and also at Carlyle. But in the very beginning, as I understand it, she was an oil economist, so there's no one better to talk to about this. So, Afsani, give us your take on this reported agreement for the Saudis and the Russians to cut back on oil production.
David, it's not clear that the agreement is as clear-cut as the markets have taken it. It's not clear that the Russians have actually agreed to what we heard in the tweets. And also not clear that this quick sugar high that the markets got on the energy side, which was close to 10% on the energy sector, while the total market went up around 2%, is something that will stay up for a long time.
So what would it take, in your judgment, for the Russians actually to agree to something like this? Because there are other issues, for example, the United States has with Russia, such as some of those sanctions over the Nord Stream pipeline.
Absolutely. You have the political issues which are ongoing and have not been resolved. On the other side is the economic issues. For the Russians and the Saudis, oil revenues constitute the largest share of their economies. So cutting back is not so straightforward at a time when they're having a lot of difficulties meeting their own situations and the expenses that are going up at a time when their own economies have slowed down. So Saudi Arabia, for example, close to 90% of its economy and revenues is coming from oil, and obviously Russia is very much based on commodities in terms of its economy. So it will be a lot of hardship for them to cut down 10 million. I also heard the number 15 million thrown around. And, if you remember when we had the refinery attacks in Saudi Arabia, oil prices did go up like we experienced today. But at the same time, they did not stay up for very long. And my belief is that while we have this quick uptick in oil prices, with the kind of demand in the economy that continues to weaken in the U.S., and even though China is up somewhat, even in China, nobody's really buying the goods that China is producing. You're not going to see a lot of sustained strength in energy markets, plus everything else that's going on, which is the storage capacities are getting filled up, and they will be pretty much filled by June. So by and large, I think oil will be more in the 30s than in the 40s to 50s, which is where people have been trying to push it to. It may even, with economy staying much weaker than people expect today, stay closer to the $20 range. But the 20 to 30, 35 seems to be where it might be sort of the new norm for oil prices.
Afsani, going beyond the energy sector, let's talk more generally about investing right now. You're responsible for investing, and you like to do it based on data. But are there data you can really rely on right now? Obviously, the jobs data are really discouraging at the moment. We thought they would be. They may have been worse than what we thought they would be. The economic data for some time are going to be somewhat uncertain, and it's going to be hard to know what to do. What does an investor do in that circumstance?
You have to sort of keep focused on the long term versus the little blips we're seeing. Obviously, the jobless claims will get worse than better, closer to 20 million. By the time we're done, and then start plateauing. I think the way we're looking at it as investors is the numbers will get worse. What we're concerned about is that in the U.S., the transition to coming back in terms of a full functioning economy may take much longer. What we've seen in Asia, and we keep on comparing to Asia, it's a very different situation. In North Asia in particular, you saw people had the masks, there were thermometers available to check people's temperatures. You had the PPEs in a very different way than we have them today. So the economies have started going back. You've seen the schools in Korea, schools in Singapore, in Taiwan, pretty much stayed open throughout the whole situation. A lot of their businesses stayed open because they had these equipment and the testing in the way they did it. In the U.S., given how far behind we are and we're still catching up, I think what we haven't thought about is that transition period is going to be longer. So if you're an investor, really you have to look beyond the next few months and look longer term, the most interesting areas, David, that we're looking at is the intersection of education, health, finance with technology. Those will stay very, very interesting areas as we're experiencing today.
Yeah, we hear things like telemedicine has really jumped up and it's probably not going to go back where it was. But let's talk about the longer term, Afsaneh. Some economists now are saying there may be demand destruction. That is to say, more or less a permanent reduction in consumption in the United States. Are you concerned about that?
You know, I think when you are in this kind of panic mode and the kinds of market volatility that we see, it's easy to jump at the other end and talk about total demand destruction. I think we're resilient. We will come back. Demand may not be at the same levels as it was before the pandemic, but it will be different, and the shape of the economy will be different. So let's say the shape of the economy today, if you look at the S&P, the energy sector actually is very small. It's only 2.8%. Technology and telecoms, which together constitute about 36%, are getting even larger. So while we're talking about demand destruction, I think what we should talk about is that the shape of employment will change. We will come out of this. There will be growth in certain areas and destruction of employment in certain areas. And it's those social equity programs that we create that will help us not have demand destruction. So a lot of what we need to do is what the government has been doing and will need to do a lot more of to create future demand. But I'm not in the school that we will have demand destruction for a very, very long time.
So technology has driven the stock market in recent years. As a practical matter, is this really a triumph potentially for technology, as we all of us are working from home, goodness knows?
Exactly. I think what happened, exactly what you just said, David, which is telemedicine. Insurance companies for 10, 15 years would not allow us to do telemedicine. Doctors would not get paid. Really, in the space of 1 week post-pandemic, they're allowing it to happen. When we come back, telemedicine, I would venture to say, will become part of our normal life. Doing meetings through Zoom or other means is becoming much more common. When we come back, it will be much more part of our life. So I think a lot of the technology was important, but the way different groups of people use technology will also change. So, for example, in my firm, the tech people who worked on technology were using Slack between them, even if they were sitting in the same room all the time. Now we're all using these tools, and when we come back from the end of the pandemic, whenever that is, I think we will be using technology differently, but also a lot of small companies will be benefiting from technology. Companies that are very small today or mid-size will be beneficiaries, as well as the larger companies.
Okay, Afsaneh, thank you so much for joining us today. That's Afsaneh Beshelas. She heads up the Rock Creek Group, but she also, I'm pleased and proud to say, is a regular contributor to Wall Street Week. That's a program that will air again tomorrow night at 6 o'clock Eastern Time, right here on Bloomberg, as we wrap up a rather extraordinary week. In the meantime, let's go to Bloomberg First Word, and we go to Mark Crumpton for that.
David, thank you very much. Concern over the coronavirus pandemic has prompted the Democratic National Committee to postpone its convention, which was due to be held in Milwaukee this summer. The delay comes after likely presidential nominee Joe Biden said it should be pushed back for safety reasons. Bloomberg has learned the convention will be held in Milwaukee now the week of August 17th. The Justice Department is distributing about 192,000 N95 masks to frontline medical workers in New York and New Jersey. They were found during an investigation by the new coronavirus hoarding and price gouging task force. Officials say gloves, gowns, hand sanitizer, and other personal protective equipment, or PPEs, were also found, and that the owner would be paid fair market value for the supplies. China is rejecting the U.S. intelligence community's claim that it hid coronavirus numbers. Bloomberg reported that spy agencies concluded that Beijing underreported both total cases and deaths from the disease. China's foreign ministry says that some American officials just want to shift the blame. Japan isn't ready to declare a national emergency over the pandemic. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe said today he'll work with local governments to fight the infection as he weighs whether to impose restrictions on the flow of materials and people. Japan has had the fewest confirmed infections among the group of 7 leading countries at about 4,200 compared to about 217,000 here in the United States. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. This coronavirus crisis is confronting all of us with choices we never thought we'd have to make, including moral choices. We're going to be joined by the leading ethicist of his generation, Michael Sandel of Harvard. That's coming up next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. If we open back up the economy, we will lose lives as to those most vulnerable. But ironically, by shutting down the economy, we'll likely lose lives as well, posing a really sharp moral dilemma for the country. So we turn to the leading ethicist of his generation. He is Michael Sandel, professor at Harvard, and we welcome him now. Thank you so much, Professor Sandel, for joining us. We had the Texas Lieutenant Governor basically saying, we had the Texas Lieutenant Governor saying basically, okay, people over 70 are going to be really vulnerable, but they'll take care of themselves. We got to get the economy back going. How do you approach an ethical dilemma like that? Because as I say, it's not just lives versus economy. When you really depress an economy, you lose lives that way too.
Well, I think it's important not to draw that distinction too sharply, not to imagine that trade-off too starkly, or to be willing to say we'll sacrifice a certain number of our senior citizens in order to get back in business, to get the economy moving again, to pump up GDP. That's a purely utilitarian way of thinking about ethics and politics and policy, and the utilitarianism of it really has a callous disregard for the precious quality of every human life. So what we really need to think about now, seems to me, is the common good. And of course, the health of the economy is part of the common good. So is public health. But more important in a way than either is the regard we have for one another, the respect we have for one another. What we really should be debating now, I think, David, is what we owe one another as citizens. This is a fundamental question of the common good.
At the same time, to some extent, if you do that and you say we're not going to make it worse for anybody in the society, you can hurt everyone by suppressing growth, by keeping people from achieving their goals, by living even comfortable lives. So how do you avoid making the trade-off that basically says we're going to suppress growth overall so we make sure we respect each individual in the society?
I think we should, in thinking about this, take a step back. Think about the slogan that we hear these days quite a lot. We're all in this together. You've heard that? I mean, they're running it on public service ads. Companies are using this as a slogan. Politicians are invoking it. We're all in this together. And what that points to is a certain moral ideal that arises from our shared vulnerability. It's a moment when we recognize our mutual dependence on one another. Now, sometimes it seems we're only mutually dependent in times of great crisis and emergency like this one. But when I say we need to take a step back and reflect on the shape of our social and economic life together, what I'm suggesting is we should ask, are we really all in it together when we think about the way we organize our economy? When we think about the people even now, like us, who can work more or less comfortably in seclusion at home, compared to those people who can't do their jobs at a laptop or at a screen, but are out there really risking their health and their lives, delivering goods and packages and groceries, to say nothing of the healthcare providers on the front lines who are risking their lives so that the rest of us can combat this pandemic. That's about mutual sacrifice. And the question is, how do we extend the spirit of mutual sacrifice into our social and economic life as a whole?
And I wonder, Professor Sandel, if that isn't a fiendish aspect of this virus, because you say we're all in this together. Typically, in times of national crisis, we come together. And in fact, the very defense against this virus is we have to be apart. In a society that already some thought was too divisive, it was picking up sides too much, it was too individualistic, and we had different groups. Now we're told we have to stay away from one another.
Exactly. And there's a deep paradox in the two phrases that are distinctive to this crisis. On the one hand, we're all in this together, but at the same time, we are all told we must engage in social distancing. Now, in the context of the virus, this makes sense. The way we fend off the common threat is to stand apart. But there is a moral paradox in these two responses. And the moral paradox plays itself out and has been playing itself out in ordinary times in the way we organize our economy and our society, because this pandemic came. It arrived at a time when we were deeply divided, when we were riven with partisan rancor and inequality that we haven't seen really in close to a century. And so in a way, we are morally unprepared for this crisis. We focus a lot on our logistical lack of preparedness, the lack of test kits, the lack of masks, the lack of ventilators. But we're also morally unprepared because we were so divided, because the inequalities had run so deep that the social bonds that hold us together as a society had become unraveled. And so the real question is, how will we emerge from this crisis, not only in terms of GDP and the stock market and public health, but also in terms of the social bonds that constitute the common life that make for a flourishing democratic society in which we really are and can say with conviction that we are all in it together.
Finally, and briefly if possible, Professor Sandel, do you have some hope? If you go back through history, have there been times of crisis like this that have led to a moral, even a spiritual awakening as people rethink their lives?
It does happen. World War II was an example. It brought the New Deal in the United States. The Great Depression brought the New Deal, and then World War II consolidated it. And in Britain, the advent of the National Health Service came in the wake of World War II. And what's interesting is that experience, the experience first of depression and then of World War II, made clear the need for solidarity. And after those crises passed, there was a season of solidarity, at least for a number of generations. But that solidarity seems to have run out in recent decades. And the hope I have is that this crisis, this pandemic, will persuade enough of us that we need to seek ways to renew our civic life so that we can really think of ourselves as being in this together, even after the virus recedes.
Thank you so much, Professor. Really appreciate you being with us today. That is Professor Michael Sandel of Harvard, an ethicist and a political philosopher. And next, we're going to talk about politics, and particularly the Democratic Convention, which has now been postponed, with Jeannie Zaino. She's Bloomberg political contributor. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Bloomberg Balance of Power. I'm David Westin. We are on television and on radio, and now we're going to turn to Jeannie Zaino, our political contributor, because there's big news, Jeannie, coming out of the Republican National Committee. They now have decided they are going to postpone their convention. Joe Biden, the presumptive nominee, has said yesterday on the Tonight Show he wanted it done. Now they've done it. Where does this leave this race? How do you have a race in the middle of a coronavirus crisis?
Well, we're absolutely in uncharted territories. And yeah, we just learned a few minutes ago they postponed from mid-July to mid-August. So that gives them another month. And we'll have to see if that still happens. But the former vice president did say he hopes that that would happen. And you're absolutely right. We've seen this campaign move to a virtual platform. And it's been a real challenge for somebody like Joe Biden, who's really been outdone by his rivals who are, much better positioned for this live streaming capacity. And of course, both of his rivals in the president and then Bernie Sanders are also in governmental positions. So the president has this daily platform of the reporters. He had 2 hours yesterday to talk. He talked about things in addition to the coronavirus. And of course, Bernie Sanders has the platform of the Senate. It's the first time in many, many years Joe Biden has sort of been outside of government and trying to get his voice out. It's very tough for that campaign right now.
Yeah, at the same time, what would you advise the vice president as a practical matter? Because he is now being somewhat critical of President Trump. Is that a smart strategy right now? We are going to pay attention to the President of the United States in a crisis like this. Is it smart to be going after him?
It is a really tough line for the vice president to have to walk. I think he does have to be critical about those things where Donald Trump has tripped up, but I do think he needs to keep his focus, number one, on the health, safety, and well-being and security of the American public, and talk about what he would do if he were in that position and what he hopes to do when he is elected, if he is. So it is a tough line for him to walk. He can't be so critical that he turns people off because, of course, people want some type of unity. That's why we've seen the president's support, his approval ratings tick up a little bit during this time of crisis.
Jeannie, you teach political science at Iona College, and it's too soon to tell, but could this crisis really precipitate a huge move toward remote voting, essentially?
Yeah, I think we're going to see that. It's been a long time coming, and I do think this is going to impact that dramatically. We're already seeing it across the country where people are pushing for mail ballots. We know that even in times that are not times of crisis, mail ballot turnout is much higher than it is in other forms of voting. So I do think we're going to see a push towards that, and I'm one of the people who thinks it's about time. We should and have to be able to continue to vote even in a time of crisis like this, but you can't ask people to be unsafe and go to, gyms and schools to vote publicly when we're told not to converge together.
Yeah, at the same time, we'll see how the Republicans feel about that, because historically, they haven't liked that idea so much. It's been more of a Democrat idea. Jeannie, thank you so much for joining us. Really great to hear your voice. That is Jeannie Zaino. She is Iona College professor, as I said, and also a Bloomberg political contributor. Coming up next, we're going to have a second hour of Balance of Power over on radio. We're going to hear more of my interview with the Vice President, Mike Pence. This is Balance of Power, and we are on Bloomberg Television and Radio.